morning, Trinitarians, and welcome back to our second in our series with Chris Graham, the curator of exhibitions at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. Chris is a historian and an Episcopalian. He's a member of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, which has deep ties to the Civil War and the Confederacy. But they've also been involved in some really interesting work over the past few months and years. And Chris has been a part of that. It's a project about history and reconciliation and what this church's role has been and all that. And I'm interested to hear more. Last week, Chris, we kind of talked as historians and thinking about culture, and we talked about faith some, but I really kind of want to get into the work of the church right now and the work that you all are doing and how it's impacted you and also the church's identity, because this is seems to me like a pretty massive shift in identity for this church. And I'm sure it was not the easiest thing to kind of navigate and steer. So tell us a little bit about the History and Reconciliation Initiative at St. Paul's.
Sure. Thanks, David. Yeah, that's that turned out to be the kind of one of the kind of guiding questions is about the church's identity, because what's ironic here is that, and I'll get into some background on the church, but what's ironic here is that in 2015, when St. Paul's decided to examine its own history with the Confederate States and its identity, the people of St. Paul's were kind of like, what are we talking about? What do you mean? You know, we are a liberal, progressive, downtown Episcopal church. We've been doing this all our lives, doing critical outreach and addressing the legacy of racial inequalities in Richmond. What does this have to do with us, really? And so that was kind of one of the animating questions: is why, why are we doing this? But why have we not noticed these Confederate symbols in our sanctuary for so long? Okay, so a little background. And so as we mentioned last week, the church was founded in 1844 in downtown Richmond. Because of its proximity to the state capitol, is literally right across the street. It was a lot of prominent Confederates attended that church, and the people of St. Paul's kind of really liked that. And after the war, kind of cultivated an image of itself as the Church of the Confederacy, as the church where Lee and Davis worshiped. And in the 1890s, as part of a larger church renovation, began installed two stained glass memorial windows to Lee and Davis, and a number of plaques and tablets to the Davis family and to Robert E. Lee in the church. Now, these plaques and tablets and these windows are kind of generic looking, except for one of the Davis ones, but they're kind of generic looking. They look like all the other 30-some plaques and tablets devoted to members of the church that are also in the sanctuary.
And importantly, as you pointed out last week, and if our folks haven't watched that last week's edition, it's a great conversation. But as you pointed out last week, the scenes in the stained glass themselves are not of Jefferson. They're not of Confederate scenes. They're actually of just straight biblical scenes, as you would see in almost any stained glass window.
Yeah. Biblical scenes, Paul before Agrippa, Moses leaving the house of Pharaoh. They don't actually picture any Confederate imagery or Confederate individuals, but the stories they tell are equal to the stories they were telling about Davis and Lee at the time. And then there's a dozen other stained glass windows, also biblical scenes. So if you're not paying attention, they kind of blend in with the rest of the interior of the church. But in 2015, after the murders at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, the rector at the time had a sermon that said, hey, we need to consider the place of Confederate identity, the place of the Confederate symbols in our church now, and what that means for us today, and does it make us a welcoming church or not? St. Paul's has always prided itself on being a welcoming church. And so they set up what's known as the History and Reconciliation Initiative that consisted of kind of three parts. One is historical research, one is memorials, to think about the memorials, plaques, tablets, windows in the church and what to do with them, and maybe create new memorials, and music and liturgy group. And we've been working, I worked in the history research one, and we've been working for on 4 years at this point on not just historical research, but diving more deeply into kind of what it means to be a white church. St. Paul's is somewhat biracial, but there are today, but it's still kind of culturally a white church, and what that means now, and kind of how do we respond to that? And so we didn't look at what about the Confederate connections and just the memorials themselves, but took a longer view examination of how did the people of St. Paul's from the time of its founding until the present time understand race in their theology and their religious practice, but also how did they then turn around and enact those beliefs in their public lives? Because St. Paul's has been a wealthy, influential church, businessmen, bankers, politicians, well connected to governors of Virginia. So there's a lot of influence there. And so over time, what we see is kind of some ups and downs, kind of some movements back and forth. I'm not describing it very well, but evolution in the way St. Paul's understood race. And so they are pro-slavery Christians during the antebellum period. They are slaveholders. They support the slaveholders' republic because they believe that is God's plan. After emancipation, they support segregation, and they develop a theory for how segregation works. Interestingly, what surprised me is in the 1920s, St. Paul's kind of adopts a social gospel approach to their Christianity and does some rather remarkable interracial work in the 1920s, to the point of them opposing some of the more draconian segregation laws in Richmond and in Virginia at the time. Not because they were initially opposed to segregation, they just thought the laws were unfair to Black people. But during the 1940s, 1950s, in the civil rights movement, St. Paul's becomes rather complacent and somewhat conservative in its approach. And so they are exactly the white liberals that, the white moderates, excuse me, that Martin Luther King is talking about in his letter from Birmingham jail. But an interesting moment happens in 1969 when a new rector comes in, and that rector is Jack Spong. And he really, it's not just him, but he really transforms the church. He deliberately ignores its history, its Confederate history, but also through kind of the intellectual rigor of his Bible studies and his approach to Christianity. And he's still out there doing it, we know, is that he brought in kind of a new generation of young people that are really interested in an active Christianity, and kind of really commits the church to supporting with its wealth causes that really kind of address problems in Richmond society. I mean, those problems result from racial inequality. And that drew other new people to the church. And so in the 1970s and 1980s, in early 1980s, people of St. Paul's are really increasingly invested in reconciliation efforts and work that can be generally described as liberal and progressive in a Christian context. And so the point is that in 2015, when the rector said, we have to re-examine what these Confederate symbols mean in our church lives and our sense of the community, a lot of people in the church said, what? We've never paid attention to these things before. They don't mean anything to us. They have not been as a part of the church life since 2015. Now, outside of the church, they have been, because it's what St. Paul's is known for, is the memorial windows. But as a congregation, a lot of people would say, why? I don't understand why we have to do this. These don't mean anything to us. And in fact, I had this strange experience just last year in 2019, 4 years after the initiative got kicked off, with a longtime church member after a service, when we were still having services in the sanctuary. Kind of walked up to me and sheepishly said, so which ones are the Davis and Lee windows? I still don't know. After 4 years of talking about them, people still didn't understand where they were, what they look like. And so, and so that's been the work. And I don't want to say the challenge, because the people of St. Paul's have really embraced this, is kind of looking back and understanding how, it's not just the windows, it's not just the plaques. They're certainly representative of something, but there is a whole history that the people of this church have created the kind of the racial landscape of Richmond that we see today as a problem, and we are somewhat responsible for it. And while the church has been working on those things for 2 generations now, it kind of deepens the commitment to understanding the depth and breadth of these inequalities in Richmond.
And I appreciate how you told that history. I mean, unflinching in kind of the negative aspects of that history, but also including the more positive things that the church was a part of as well. And to be able to kind of have a nuanced conversation about kind of a church's history. It's not all bad and all good, that we're human beings and we're flawed, and we get wrapped up in our own cultures and the sin within that as well. And so the churches gets sucked up into that as well, but they also do good work. Certainly you would have loved to have seen a church oppose segregation in the 1920s fully, but to at all in the South at that time is, I mean, you hate to use the term better than nothing, because like what you would want would be a faithful commitment to no segregation at all. But anyway, I say that because, over the past couple of years, Trinity has taken to like examining its history, and our rector, Scott, has kind of led a series of adult forums, like really diving into who we are, who we have been, and what that history is. And it's a mix of good and bad. It's a mix of all those things that are a part of our history and a part of who we are, and how we engaged with people of color in our community, and in our church, particularly right after the Civil War, and the partnership that developed with St. Matthias, the historically Black church right down the street from us. And so it's hard to have these conversations, I feel like, in the environment that we're in sometimes, because people tend to get defensive in some way, whether defensive that, we should just kind of, tear it all down because it's awful and terrible, or don't touch the church, or don't touch these things because they're meaningful to me in some way. But to actually be able to have a conversation to contextualize them, to me, is actually really difficult work of faith, because you're dealing with your identity and where your faith connects with that identity, and where the place where you've experienced God connects with it. I imagine that a particular place like St. Paul's, that was really difficult, because you're dealing with things that are really close to your soul. And that is genuinely hard work that, kind of has to be acknowledged. It's not just hard within the system. It's not just hard to hear the truths. It's actually hard soul work to do as well.
Yeah. And it
is tied up with who we understand ourselves to be.
Yeah. And the challenging thing for me personally is, and this may be the case for other people at St. Paul's, is when you listen to the people from history talk about why they are making decisions about racial inequality, and why they are practicing slavery, and why they are practicing segregation. If you listen to them and take them seriously, and not just kind of approach them with a sense of moral outrage that everything they say is wrong and deceitful, what you learn is that, whatever time period we're talking about, the pre-Civil War, post-emancipation, the social gospel period thereafter, is that they are operating from a sense of what they understand as God's intentions, but also operating from what they understand to be a place of love. All right. These are not the virulent, violent racists. In the 1920s, this church was preaching anti-Klan and anti-lynching from its pulpit.
Right. I was about to say, we're not talking about KKK people.
Yeah, no. This is not that church.
Who are anti-lynching and speaking about it publicly.
Yeah, and so they're, as perverse as it sounds, they understand they're operating slavery from a place of love, because we care for Black people more than abolitionists do. We are holding them in this position that is altogether better for them. Now, of course, we know that's, I'm not going to use the profanity.
But
that's wrong.
It's
in so many ways.
Right.
It's wrong. But they operated from a sense of, we are always acting in the best interest of Black people when we make decisions about slavery or segregation, or integration to some degree. And it's, I know it sounds perverse to even, assert that, but they really do believe they're operating for the best interest of everyone involved. And so the challenging thing, but what we can see is that they are doing harm at every step of the way. They're not doing this out of hate. They're not doing this out to, persecute people just for the sake of persecuting them. But harm is still being produced. And what the challenge to me is that don't I think that I'm operating out of a sense of love today?
Right. That's the hard part to hear and all that, is because first it's hard to hold those two things in tension, that their motivations really were how they understood love. Mm-hmm. And it also did kind of great harm. And when I look at the way I operate in the world, is, of course, I do everything, at least I try to, out of a sense of trying to do good in the world and to love others. This is what Jesus says: love your neighbor as yourself. Love God and love others. Mm-hmm. And so it is hard, because it does make you go, oh, what is the work that I need to do to make sure the good that I'm doing actually is good? Which can be exhausting if you take it to extremes in some cases. And it can be paralyzing too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, constant self-examination and constant listening to voices that criticize your own position is healthy and helps you avoid the blind spots that you might have.
Right. Yeah, I think of relationships being a real kind of buffer against those kinds of missteps, where you're doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, which can sometimes do a lot more damage than doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons, in some cases. Because, when we get involved in what we believe to be something good, that righteousness can give us a lot of energy. So kind of being in partnership and relationship with others, particularly those who have completely different life experiences or histories than us, I really do think is a work of faith, is an expression of faith, and is itself an expression of love, maybe even sometimes a first step in our expression of love in these kinds of situations. Well, I do want to leave some time for any questions that folks might have. So last week we asked if there were any questions that people might have for you. So we are going to, I'm going to gather those questions real quick, and then I will put those to you. One question was, for churches who are considering addressing the kind of work that St. Paul's has done, what advice do you have? And what do you think is kind of most important to consider or to do at the beginning?
Well, as my wife would remind me to always say, start with a lot of prayer. I've got a couple bullet points on this that I kind of worked up that may or may not be a great answer to the question, but kind of how to start it and how to think about it. When St. Paul's began the process, I wasn't actually a member of St. Paul's at that moment, but they hired a expert facilitator, someone who professionally facilitates difficult conversations, and set up a series of prayerful conversations to try to discern how to go about doing, this kind of work, and make recommendations. And part of what that does is that it works hard to ensure that as many people as possible are on board with the project. And we've certainly had our successes and our failures as the History and Reconciliation Initiative at St. Paul's. And I think a lot of times some of our, I'm not airing any dirty laundry here, but, places where we have not done as well as possible is when there's been a perception that we as a small committee in the church are acting unilaterally or alone or without the rest of the congregation knowing what we're doing. And so that means that buy-in and communication is important. You got to keep folks on board with the project. It'll be challenging, but
I could see how easily a project like that could, and I'm not saying it does all the time, but I can see how easily it could slip into almost like a shaming kind of thing rather than a learning and an education kind of thing. And I wonder if you could speak to how you keep that line, keep from crossing that line, because I don't think any of this work is about shaming people into feeling bad about their history or anything like that, but it's learning, it's education.
Yeah. I brought a lot of that to this project from my background as an academic historian. In that, in doing this research, we weren't, trying to seek out or, uncover historical examples to be outraged about, or ashamed of, or to argue with. You just can't argue with people in history. But
it's a good point. We try sometimes. You
can disagree, but you can't, but the point is that instead of doing that, what we do is what I did, and what I think we brought to this, and what I think one of the things the project does well in is that instead of kind of shaming them, what we try to do is understand and explain why they did what they did, based on taking their own explanations seriously. We can be empathetic, we can understand them, we can still love them, but we can still disagree with them and be horrified by what they did and acknowledge that they created harm in our world.
Yeah. I mean, anybody who's done their own genealogical research, I think, may have encountered this, where you encounter things that you're both proud of, things that surprise you, things that upset you. But it doesn't change the fact that that's all part of your history and your ancestry. And learning from that has value, no matter what it is you're learning from.
Yeah, that's true.
How widespread in the South, particularly in Episcopal churches, was the institution of slavery? I mean, is this something that most of your Episcopal churches, particularly in the South, probably have some kind of connection in history to, provided they were around during that time?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about the practice of actual churches owning enslaved people, or churches enslaving people. The one study I'm familiar with, and this is off the top of my head, so I can't remember I'll get this for you. I can't remember the author or the title of the book, but it was a study of slaveholding by churches in Virginia. And the practice, I can't speak for other denominations, but in the Episcopal Church, the practice tended to kind of trail off in the early 19th century. So by the time we get to the American Civil War and the height of the pro-slavery power, I don't know if there's really any Episcopal churches, parishes that actually own slaves. Now there probably are, there's always exceptions to rules. And I'm sure that, someone can kind of point out some examples. Now, the thing is that Episcopal churches, unlike Baptist and Methodist churches, are, same today as they're, have a smaller footprint on the landscape. And Episcopal churches in the 19th century slaveholding states tended to be kind of located in urban areas and have wealthier members. Yeah. And so, and these are slave owners. The wealthier you are in the American South, the more likely it is you are enslaving people. Now, there are occasions, and so Leonidas Polk, Bishop of Louisiana, one of the cornerstones of Sewanee, these are plantation owners and own enslave large numbers of people on plantations. But in these urban areas, at least what I gather from St. Paul's is that the ownership of enslaved people usually is for domestic service, for working in small industries.
One of the projects that I want to point out is one by Sewanee called, I believe it's the Roberson Project, that does a really great job of detailing all those connections. And so it's worth checking out. So there's a lot of resources out there in the Episcopal Church for people who are curious, and we'll put some of those in the description to kind of do some of that exploring and investigating as well.
Yeah. Can I add something to that?
Yeah, please.
Tracking the slaveholding numbers and the average numbers of enslaved people that slave owners owned, or the way they used them, exploited them,
right,
put them to work, is one thing. And you can get on a profitable rabbit hole there. But another thing to think about is, just the fact of enslaving a person isn't the total mark of what matters here, because what you have at the same time is that the larger church is promulgating a pro-slavery Christianity that everyone buys into.
Right.
Almost, let me back up. That most white people buy into.
Okay.
And so
beyond the Episcopal Church.
I'm sorry?
This is beyond the Episcopal Church. You're talking about the.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
All of the denominations in all the Protestant denominations in the United States are engaging in some form of a pro-slavery Christianity, and that affects not only their theology but also their lived religion, how they act out their religious beliefs in public and in their relationships with enslaved people. Whether you're a slaveholder or not, you buy into that.
Right. So I guess that kind of leads to our final question of, we've kind of tap danced around the idea that a lot of our churches have been inextricably caught up with this at some point in their history. There's a legacy there in many of our churches, whether it's big or small. It tends to be there in some way. Whether it's land that was donated by a slaveholder, or the church itself was built by enslaved people. This is not an uncommon narrative in churches throughout particularly the South. What does any church do to address that kind of legacy? How does one kind of go about even grappling with that, particularly for many of us who may be unaware of some of that history, as you talked about, some of the people at St. Paul's were unaware of which windows were the Confederate homage windows. Where do you start? I mean, how do you address that kind of legacy that's so deeply tied in with the good and the bad? Do you think some of these slave owners didn't donate the land as a way to try to prop up white supremacy, but as an act of faith that was genuine and honest and faithful? I mean, how do you parse that? What do you do with that contradiction, so to speak?
Sure. I think there's a couple different ways to respond to that one. I think certainly doing close self-study over a long period of time is critical, because then you get to, and what I mean is, you got to go beyond slavery, because emancipation in 1865, the 13th Amendment, obviously didn't solve all the problems. The problems continue to evolve, and so a lot of church people participated in kind of creating those problems, of segregation and Jim Crow, of inequitable education and economic access, and just the physical layout of cities, and displacement and environmental racism. These are all 20th century phenomenons that are in some way rooted in slavery, but also some way unique to the 20th century. And so don't limit yourself just to the sin of slaveholding. There's been a lot of sin since. But getting to know those things, and this is my point here, getting to know those things is that through deep self-study, is that you get to understand specifically what you get closer to having an authentic sense of what the people of your own parish have done in the past, and what they might authentically confess, repent, seek forgiveness for. Certainly we can all go out and say, yeah, all of America is rooted in racist history, and so we're sorry for that. But that doesn't get to saying how well key individuals in your church advocated for the placing of a highway through a black neighborhood,
Right.
and it a general confession doesn't
Right.
set you up for addressing this very specific problem in your very specific neighborhood.
And so Trinity has started some of that process, and those who are watching this may or may not know that we had a weeks-long series last year that really began to dive into the history of Trinity. I think one gift that comes out of that is that you also stumble upon good examples of your history that you get to hold up as icons to help push you forward. That it's not just about the bad that you've done, which is important to confess and to face, but there's also instances in our histories which are worth holding up as lights.
Certainly, this gets back to, maybe it's just me and my academic mindset, but I tend to, I tend to strip the moral judgments out of the
Sure.
historical analysis, and so I don't tend to think of these people as bad or good.
Right.
But I can certainly, use my modern sensibility and say, and see how things change, and see where people did things that appeal to our sensibilities now, but may also have been flawed at the same time.
Sure.
And so, I'm thinking about the, when St. Paul's became overcome with the social gospel in the 1910s and 1920s and engaged in interracial cooperation efforts. And that's not something you'd expect. And that's really amazing because they, used that to oppose segregation laws in Virginia in the 1920s. And,
right.
Wow, cool.
So these kind of two things.
They were still severe racial paternalists.
Right.
That were saying horrible things,
These two kind of things exist side by side sometimes, almost in the same breath.
Yeah. Yeah. And so kind of, the question about how you deal with it, certainly talking about it and acknowledging it and learning from it and using it to enact some kind of practice change is one way of doing that. Kind of saying that, oh, that was in the past, it doesn't matter, it's got no relationship to us today, is probably not a healthy way of dealing with these unpleasant facts. Another way I think to think about it is kind of using a reparations framework. And I say that because I just finished reading, and I recommend this, Jennifer Harvey's book called Dear White Christians.
Okay.
And she's an academic that kind of compares reconciliation frameworks and reparation frameworks, in which moves us closer toward actual kind of healing and repair. And so, admitting that, your church might have benefited from harm that its members occasioned in the past is a starting point to thinking about what's my obligation to repairing that harm now. And kind of it's critical in discerning what that is and what a course of action might be, that the folks to whom harm was done be a part of that conversation, of course. And that's a long process. We're not even
process. It's a long process that requires a lot of discernment, probably, and a lot of engagement, a lot of that kind of groundwork of learning and understanding. And
trust building.
Yeah.
But the idea at the core of that is that we have to do something that's more than just, hey, I admitted it, let's be friends now.
I feel like the core of that is this sense of we do have a responsibility to each other as human beings and as fellow children of God. Like, we do have a responsibility to care for one another and to put right the harm that was done in whatever ways we can. We can't undo it. And it's I don't know if it's helpful to spend time. I wonder if it's more helpful to spend our time thinking about how we might repair harm than it is spending our time lamenting that harm was done. Not that you can really have one without the other, but it is easy to get lost in the lamenting the harm that has been done, and not think about how do we repair that harm and build those bridges, and where in our history has that harm happened, and where have we taken those steps to repair that harm in the past, and are those helpful stepping stones for us? Well, Chris, we are about out of time, and I'm so grateful for all the time that you've spent with us and the ways that you've kind of helped us answer some of our questions, and given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much, Chris. We're so grateful for your time, and for your expertise, for your wisdom, and for your patience. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks, David. And thanks everyone who submitted questions and paid attention to this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.